Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to Imperial College's Centre for Languages, Culture and Communication. We're proud to host these research seminars regularly, which show the best and the brightest outputs and projects and research and publications from our wonderful staff and students. And it's great to host this one today. My name is Michael Weatherburn. I'm the field leader for humanities and social sciences within the Horizons program, which is one of the big teaching programs of our centre. I'm also privileged to participate in the MSc in Science Communication, which is how I met our speaker today. So I'm happy to introduce Claudia Cannon and her talk, UK Radical Science, Its History, Legacies and Relevance Today. So some background on our speaker. Claudia started originally by doing an undergraduate degree in fine art painting. And now, having got to know her over these few years, I can see why she's a great eye for artistic issues. Then after a year abroad in Italy, she needed a job and found herself at the maths department at Imperial College covering for someone who was away. Then during that role shifted into a science communication role within Imperial College and has taken on a particular interest in linking the sciences and the arts and communicating both together. She then conducted an MSc in science communication, which our centre hosts. We have dozens of excellent students per year. And it was a privilege to work with her on her dissertation during that degree on which this talk is based. And since then, she works in an internal organisation at Imperial called Undaunted, a partnership between Imperial's Grantham Institute of Climate Change and the Environment and the Royal Institution, focusing on tackling climate change with innovation. The organisation is called Undaunted, and it draws together expertise from the varied professions and backgrounds to create a hub of innovation in climate change, which really aligns with Claudia's interest in pulling people together to pull their thoughts and interdisciplinarity, a common theme at both our centre and the talk today, and especially on such an essential and optimistic area of research as climate change innovation. Can't wait to hear more. Claudia, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Michael. Okay, I'm just gonna share my screen. There's always a bit of a process of doing that, and then crack on with the presentation. So I've got some notes to follow because I realised that it's been 5 years since I did this research, and I was slightly frantic this morning trying to sort of pull my brain back into academic ways of thinking, but the dissertation has kind of stayed with me during that time and has been relevant to my career in different ways, and also seems to be of interest to other people whenever I sort of mention it. So I thought it was kind of relevant to come back and revisit it and maybe see today less as a kind of academic seminar, but more into just giving a bit of an insight into the research that I did, which is kind of very related to the history of science and kind of sparks important channels of inquiry into contemporary society. So thank you to everybody who's joined today, and big shout out to Michael Weatherburn, because he was a great supervisor. Thank you, Michael, and to Sheila as well for organising today. So my dissertation was about a radical socialist science group active between the late 1960s and the early 1990s called the British Society for Social Responsibility in Science, which is quite a mouthful. So they abbreviated it to BSSRS. Yes, it's working. So slide 2. So much of my primary source material came from interviews with 6 former BSSRS members. They're listed here, and they were super kind and gave their time to talk with me. And a lot of the richness of the dissertation comes from their reflections. So definitely couldn't have done it without them. And I'm actually still in touch with them all. And I know at least one of them, Colin, is in the call today, which is brilliant. I was a bit last minute and rubbish about spreading word, so the others may have not been able to join, but yeah, great to see you, Colin. I also analysed a variety of BSSRS related material, of which there's loads, such as letters, articles, pamphlets and magazines, and they're held in collections at the Science Museum, the Wellcome Collection and UCL, and there's a few examples in the slide here. And as you can see, it's very visual, and this definitely kind of appealed immediately to my background in arts and graphic design. So BSSRS evolved from a 1968 campaign against university research on chemical and biological weapons, which itself had emerged within the ferment of activism against the Vietnam War and broader political, social, and counterculture movements of the 1960s. Activism against chemical warfare wasn't new. The CND, which is the Campaign for Nuclear Disarmament, and you can see the symbol in the banners on the slide here, was started in the late 1950s in response to horrific atrocities like USA's nuclear bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki in 1945. And there was also the very real and terrifying threat of the Cold War, which was overshadowing this period too. So as well as being affiliated with left-wing initiatives such as the CND, Busra's roots stemmed from broader historical movements within radical and trade union politics. But it also had significant ties to the scientific establishment. Its inaugural meeting was at the Royal Society and was attended by numerous preeminent figures. And the Nobel laureate Maurice Wilkins was its president throughout. And by 1969, one of my interviewees, Jonathan Rosenhead, said, with the help of Maurice Wilkins, we had an amazing galaxy of top scientists saying we think that science should be socially responsible. So the assumption that scientific knowledge was value-free, the royal route to truth, had underpinned Western intellectual thought since the 17th century. And in the 1960s, the use-abuse model continued to dominate academia. And that model viewed science as essentially objective and only problematic once it left the lab and fell into the wrong hands. Though at the time, developments in the philosophical and social sciences were increasingly challenging this idea. So when in 1970, Busra adopted the slogan, "Science is not neutral," it was seen as being unbelievably provocative and incomprehensible to the contemporary scientific establishment. Busra's rejection of science as neutrality was seen as swearing in church. So activism against the Vietnam War was happening alongside much larger countercultural radical politics in the 60s, including the free speech, civil rights, feminist and workers' movements. And though these were diverse in terms of communities and motivations, they shared a desire to liberate society in various ways. And it was in this cultural context that Busra's members were motivated to open their science up in both theory and practice to influences and cultures beyond academia, and also to consider the connections between their roles as objective scientists in relation to their personal feelings about the consequences of their profession beyond academia. So local branches sprang up across the UK from Edinburgh to Brighton, and similar and connected radical science movements also sprung up in other countries, including the US. The Society published its manifesto in around 1969, and you can see the front cover here. And inside this publication, they stated, "This organisation believes that the development of science is not predetermined, but should depend on the social choices of the community and the individual choices of the scientist." And it had four main aims: to provoke scientists' awareness of the social significance of their practice and increase awareness of their individual and collective social responsibilities, to expose and analyse the political, social and economic pressures affecting science's development, to bring public attention to the implications and consequences of science and to create an informed public which can exercise choice in these matters, and to foster international exchange on the matters. So examples of Busra's very early newsletter give a good sense of the kinds of issues that the members were concerned with. The subjects were broad and international in scope. So this is an example from issue 2 in 1969, which critiques America's Apollo space program. The author questions why such vast resources are being pumped into this venture when space exploration is already providing incredible opportunities for solar system physics without the need to send a human being to the moon. And they argue that Apollo is a conscious weapon of political warfare, and that the science, though of good quality, is a byproduct of the American government's military motivations as they attempt to save face during the antagonistic space race against the USSR. And they conclude no human activity can opt out of the dilemmas of the society in which it is operating. And this is an obvious parallel to the contemporary space race, and exposes relevant questions about who funds science and how and why it is funded, and the power dynamics of that, especially in terms of decision-making, which affects citizens' everyday lives. But also ethical dimensions. I came across this story about who owns the sky, and the future of covering the sky, the night sky, with corporations' advertisements. So that's obviously potentially very contentious. So returning to 1970, in issue 7, the editors comment on the recent UK elections, calling on BSSRS members to reject the mealy-mouthed utilitarianism of the government's approach to science funding. They write, "We must question the ends to which our science is directed, and if the ends, the means." They propose that if the main effect of increased investment in science is, for example, improved war technology or enzyme washing powders, it may be good for the economy, but not necessarily either for people or for science. And if the election is not about such issues, it is scarcely worth having. Oops. Issue 8 from 1970 details how a BSSRS working group had assisted the Cumberland County Council in deciding whether to accept or reject increased discharge of radioactive waste into the Irish Sea by the Atomic Energy Authority. And the article reveals the tension that exists between good policy making, ensuring energy demands are met, and an ethical approach to science, environmental and social protection. And the world continues to grapple with these kinds of questions in terms of water, sewage, renewable energy, fracking, oil extraction, and big boss bonuses in a cost of living crisis, COVID lockdowns to save lives versus its implications in terms of jobs and education. So many different examples. Other issues of the newsletter deal with pollution, electronic and atomic warfare, and technological crowd control during the Troubles in Northern Ireland, including the use of CS gas and rubber bullets. So in the early days, BSSRS had seemed set to function as a normal scientific pressure group, but questions immediately arose about how radical the society should endeavour to be. In 1970, when they adopted the slogan, "Science is not neutral," a handful of members staged an intervention at the annual British Association for the Advancement of Science meeting in Durham, which was a popular and very public gathering of the scientific elite. BSSRS raised political questions at technical sessions, distributed leaflets challenging the BAAS, and organised a street theatre performance depicting the inhumane effects of chemical and biological warfare as delegates exited the presidential address. And this activity was kind of like a key turning point in BSSRS history. It showed that certain members aimed to assert themselves as reflexive radicals, rallying against not only the misuse of science in the realm of politics, but also against the hierarchical nature within the cultures of science itself. The premise of my dissertation drew from a narrative of radical socialist science by historian and former BSSRS member Gary Werski. He proposes that the 20th century saw 2 waves of fervent political activism in Britain by scientists. The first was between 1931 to 56, and a second between 1968 to 88. And actually in this paper, he also suggests that there's a potential for a third movement to take shape. The 1930s generation were closely aligned with Communist Party politics and initially were pro-Soviet science. They maintained an intrinsic optimism in science as a progressive historical force and were enraptured, at least initially, by the Soviet Union as the apparent quintessence of scientific socialism, a belief bolstered by Russia's apparent immunity to the pervasive economic fallout of the 1929 Wall Street crash. Russia had been Britain's ally in World War II, and Soviet Marxism had developed theories that challenged the notion of scientific neutrality. It proposed that science had been shaped by the needs of capitalism, specific to bourgeois society, and suggested that a socialist science would ask different questions and provide a different theoretical framework. Many of the 1930s generation, however, subsequently rejected the USSR's authoritarian form of Stalinist, Leninist Marxism, and also Stalin's unwavering support of Lysenko's pseudoscience, with brutal penalties for scientists who didn't toe the party line. A bit further on into the 20th century, BSSRS's 1970s generation were profoundly against the authoritarian trajectory that socialism had taken in the USSR, and were viewed more as the liberal elite, Labour Party types, though some would have described themselves as Trotskyist or libertarian Marxist. One of my interviewees, Jonathan Rosenhead, recalls that although he personally never did anything more to the left than the Labour Party, many of his contemporaries aligned with libertarian ideals to revolutionise the system rather than merely to try to reform it. Another interviewee, Peter Harper, said it became cool to describe yourself as a libertarian socialist. So people were saying, I'll go for the ethics of communism, but don't go for the authoritarian top-down Leninist model. Some members were fervently opposed to political parties altogether, including the Communist Party and its Trotskyist Maoist branches, and described themselves simply as libertarian. So obviously that kind of suggests that the political terminology in the 1970s was fertile ground for kind of debate and creativity. It's also important to emphasize that BuzzRit evolved into an umbrella organization that was seen to represent various but not all aspects of radical science in Britain. And Werski actually emphasizes that part of its identity was its plurality. And though each BuzzRit member would likely have defined themselves as socialist, this terminology will have been used to describe a broad spectrum of political values and motivations. Nevertheless, this got me intrigued by the idea of socialist libertarianism, which seemed inherently contradictory. I was trying to question how they were negotiating and reconciling the idea of collective or communal living with personal freedom. And thanks to Michael, I considered it in relation to more recent literature that explores the idea of personal freedom and suggests connections between radical New Left thinking of the 1970s and Thatcher's neoliberal conservative ideology of the 1980s. And Colin Thernhurst, one of my interviewees, said by the 60s, you might say libertarianism had won out against Stalinism. And I think that was reflected in the things that we did. Another interviewee, Marianne Craig, said that initially its intrinsic contradictions did not present a problem. We respected the individual while being able to do collective action, and it didn't feel like a tension, but of course it was. The notion of the revolution, inspired by mythical contemporary figures like Che Guevara, became a poignantly romanticized feature of popular culture until the late 1970s. The idea that there could be a great turnover of society and all the bits would fall into the right places appealed to many left-leaning radicals, including some radical scientists, though, I quote one of my interviewees, "Today we just regard that aghast as the most appalling mistake. You shake things up and they fall and it's just chaos." Craig recollects their naivety in the belief that they were part of an international revolutionary network that would crush capitalism without hurting anybody, and draws a line between her distrust of political parties back then and her subsequent profession as a career coach now. "We have become obsessed by ourselves," she says, "and personal fulfillment and expression. We weren't interested in any of that back then. We were interested in collective action." The radical technologists who were part of the movement, or a part of the movement, were trying to shake everything up and introduce alternative values rather than specifically socialist values. Here I quote Harper again, Peter Harper, "We were much more interested in agency and freedom, which is perhaps a different value to the egalitarian values of socialism." And my interviewees were also really generous in kind of reflecting on, again, I quote here, when libertarianism got hijacked by right-wing politicians. So Colin Thernhurst revised his ideological position and subsequently identified as a local socialist. He became a Labour Party member, viewing the inherent tensions of socialist libertarianism as a creative political force, one served better from within mainstream left-wing politics than from the outside. But he still says that the sense of individual liberty and freedom, the anarchism it espoused, he says, "I thought it was very important to retain, but I still believed in the need for a state of some sort, preferably a highly decentralized state. I was quite happy as a libertarian socialist to be working with a local Labour authority." Another interviewee, Peter Harper's, politics also went through a process of evolution, as gradually we realized that anarchism was very similar to some kinds of conservatism in its emphasis on individual liberty. And so this more recent literature explores the porous boundary between left-wing libertarianism in theory and its cooperation in the practices of right-wing neoliberalism. But there's a crucial difference between the new left's focus on personal autonomy and the new right's focus on freedom for market growth. But despite this distinction, the inherent conflict of socialist libertarianism provides an unresolved sentiment, a primordial political soup from which a new ideology would soon evolve. And one of the pieces of literature that I looked at, Radical Technology, a book that was actually edited by Peter Harper, one of my interviewees, there's a chapter on shelter, and it kind of echoes this mentality. It says, materials are scarce, fuel is in short supply, and prices are escalating. To survive, one is going to have to be either rich or resourceful, either more dependent upon or freer from centralized production and controls. The choices are not clear-cut, for these are complex times, but it is obvious that the more we can do for ourselves, the greater will our individual freedom and independence be. And the slide shows a page from this book. So Harper, the editor and contributor to this book, acknowledges in retrospect that the New Left's libertarian focus and its unresolved tensions may have helped sow the seeds for the acceptance of neoliberalism. And as the publication for this book was being finished in 1974-75, Harper met an economist from Chicago at a completely alternative dinner. And he told me that he'd asked her about the new ideas coming out of the Chicago School of Economics at that time in relation to Thatcher's funny ideas about things. And the economist's impression was that the situation was pretty serious. So he kind of recollects that the weird new economic ideas were also viewed with amused bafflement. It started off as just a few people having coffee together. It was very small at the beginning. And you can see that this is reflected in radical technology, in the absence of reference. There isn't any hint of neoliberalism. And it assumes, Peter Harper sort of reflects on that publication. He says it assumes a kind of benign landscape of cooperative people living modestly sensible lives. That was our vision, really, and it still is. And he sort of continues to say it was unanticipated and extraordinary, therefore, that by the mid-1980s, neoliberalism had completely taken over as the new ideology. I also quote him as he says, Milton Friedman and the whole gang, they managed to persuade them, Thatcher et al., and I think that we must take some responsibility for sort of spreading an idea about personal individual freedom rather than collective responsibility. So in the 1980s, Thatcher's neoliberal policies incited a kind of conflicted realization of the intrinsic challenge to socialist libertarian ideology. Buzz members found themselves negotiating tensions that were at odds with the ethos of collective responsibility as advocated by the society. Considering the broader ideological landscape of the 1970s is important background when examining the reasons why some of the Buzz members became so anti-authoritarian and radicalized at that time. So Peter Harper, my interviewee, actually asked the question, why were we so anti-authoritarian? And kind of continued on to provide a few suggestions as to what the context of the time, the part it had to play. Partly it was a reaction to the tyranny and bureaucracy of Soviet socialism, influenced by the popular Cold War narrative of a free capitalist West versus the authoritarian communist East. Also a reaction to science's part in the development of chemical and biological weapons alongside the backdrop of the Vietnam War and the Cold War. And that is a reaction to the potential power dynamics inherent in science. Chris Ryan, another of my interviewees, spoke about the severity of the West's very clear alignment of science and scientific research with the military-industrial complex. Additionally, there was a pervasive anxiety in the 70s about science's inadvertent negative side effects that had contributed to things like acid rain, ozone layer depletion, and air and water pollution. And so post the post-war drive to rebuild Europe and the tremendous optimism in science and technology in the 40s and 50s, it had sort of run out of steam by the early 1980s, and partly induced by Rachel Carson's book, Silent Spring, which kind of shattered the scientific strand of post-war optimism in infinite scientific progress. Her writing pulled together evidence exposing the double-edged reality of extensive and haphazard pesticide use, subverting a powerful paradigm, one that promised better living through chemistry. Peter Harper emphasised that by the 70s, we thought it's all falling to pieces because there's an intrinsic incompatibility between modern advanced industrial society and the integrity of the biosphere. He also went on to say that by the late 80s, powerful convictions that the world would fall apart had not proved true. Many pressing environmental problems during that period were seemingly mitigated by the creation of international environment ministries and a concerted political effort towards actively enforced legislation. So, for example, in 1972, the UN conference saw a fundamental shift from end-of-pipe approach to pollution, which focused on neutralizing its effects, towards more sophisticated processes that would design pollution out. Chris Ryan, my interviewee, said it was and still is in lots of ways a real basis for hope that we can intelligently redesign what we find we need for our existence. But currently, that very optimistic idea is being challenged by climate change, because the reality of how much we have to reduce the emissions of carbon into the atmosphere requires much more rapid change and innovation than anything we had before. Taking you back to the 1970s again. The same interviewee, Chris Ryan, who was talking about intelligently redesigning what we need to exist, recalls the process of rationalization he experienced as his radical politics began to shatter the romantic idea that science was about resolving all the evils of the world. My interview's reflections highlight the seemingly perpetual paradox of technology. The more technology we create, the more problems we create, and it is then technology that we turn to for solutions. This guy on the left is American theorist Theodore Roszak, and he had considerable influence on some BUSRA members. They invited him to a debate in the UK in 1970. He identified technocracy as the system against which the radical new left of the 1970s was rebelling. Roszak argued that the technocratic Western societies of the late 1960s unequivocally upheld the ideals of modernization, affluence, and efficiency as indication of progress, whereby those who govern justify themselves by appeal to technical experts, who in turn justify themselves by appeal to scientific forms of knowledge, and beyond the authority of science, there is no appeal. He developed the argument that technocracy eludes all political categories and renders itself ideologically invisible. So for Roszak, the political orientation of the society is relatively insignificant. Capitalist or socialist, technocracy insidiously influences all cultural spheres, whilst positioning itself as an entirely neutral, natural, and an inevitable phenomenon that operates beyond doubt. So in the 70s, the radical scientists were trying to shake everything up and conceive a way to dismantle the monopolization of science and technology by the few who could afford to have a stake in forging its direction. Peter Harper told me we were suckers for all that. So that whole late 60s, 70s, and early 80s, we just surfed on this fantastic sense that science all belongs to them, an elite, and we've got to remake it and take it back or create a completely different kind of science. He argues that science, from the conception and realization of an idea through decisions about what to fund, all the way to its technological and engineered applications, is highly political, and says that the radical scientists wanted a completely different kind of structure. BSSRS too emphasised the need to open the culture of science to the scrutiny of Parliament, the press, the scientific community, and to suggest how decisions could be spread more widely and more democratically. This vision intended to liberate society from science's potential hegemony. It also aimed to liberate science from its co-option by various dominant groups with deeply hierarchical views about what science was like and how society worked. BSSRS wanted to deconstruct the symbiotic relationship and interaction between science and technology, emphasizing that discovery precedes invention, and invention in turn presages discovery, proposing the following questions: what is the role of the scientist, and who is to be master? The radical rethinking of professions is a characteristic trend of the 1970s, a period which is viewed as a decade of possibility. And these ideas permeated every sphere. BSSRS's radical health visitors and midwives, for example, wanted to empower women more by the very nature of their work. This is a quote from one of my interviewees, Marianne Craig. She says, "Radical architects and radical teachers, radical everything. We questioned the profession, we questioned the hierarchy, but also the content. How do you do your profession?" And I think that was influential, actually. And the important thing about all that was that they were unaligned. On the whole, they weren't wanting to join a revolutionary party. And the questioning of how scientists do their profession is a key thread of the Good Science Project, which I'm involved in now with another of my MSc tutors, Dr. Stephen Webster. It's not radical or revolutionary in any kind of political sense, but we are in the forums that we organise, a few of which are examples of which are here, are exposing questions and kind of providing spaces for reflection. We're trying to bring colleagues together in person, outside of the buzz of the office or lab or inbox, and just to eat lunch and sort of think about particular topics of the doing of science. And our future day of doubt on the 27th of September will explore the value and challenge and questions around doubt in professional contexts, from science to journalism, through lenses such as religion, philosophy, and ethics. So maybe we can send around the mailing list if anyone's interested in joining us, and you can be kept up to date. One article in Buzzard's magazine, Science for People, describes scientists involved in weapons development as men who have rejected their obligations to humanity and have allowed themselves to be used as tools of oppression. It's clear from their manifesto that Buzzer put primary responsibility in the hands of the scientist, but their emphasis is on investing the scientist with innate social accountability, a collective obligation rather than a personal freedom. They were also realistic about the necessity for science to build relationships across connected cultures in politics, industry, education, the media, and other segments of society. And it's also important to emphasize that for most Buzzer members, they were neither anti-science conservationists keen to discredit its value, nor science salvationists failing to distinguish between innovation and progress. Rather, they themselves were scientists seeking to envisage alternative kinds of science and technology that could somehow be guaranteed against misuse. The role of the state in relation to the notions of freedom and responsibility in science is also interesting to consider. In the 60s, big companies were funding their own research programs, particularly in the pharmaceutical field. But university research was almost entirely funded by research councils and the state, and academic scientists were proud of this perceived independence from external corporate influence. That model began to shift. The University of Warwick was one of the first to strike up a corporate partnership agreement with the motor industry, and a polemic account of this is detailed in E.P. Thompson's Warwick University Limited. It was a trend that Buzzard's members evidently opposed as, and I quote Harper here, tremendously, profoundly shocking, because this was a crack in the dike. People's research was being invaded by the forces of commerce. And then you fast forward half a century, and academic research and the business of higher education are even more intrinsically linked to corporate finance, as universities employ teams dedicated to striking up industrial partnerships and sourcing funding and scholarships from alumni. Peter Harper said that this kind of funding model is now accepted as part of the modern settlement. The idea that this private sector is the engine of the economy, the money that's generated in the private sector is able to finance things that are of public benefit. That's the new common idea. The state doesn't want to get involved. It likes the idea that the progress of science is decided not by committees and an ideology, but by something neutral and God-given, and that is the market. And there's a kind of interesting parallel between faith in the neutrality of science and faith in the neutrality of the market that kind of demonstrates the ideological potency of ostensibly straightforward alternative solutions to society's problems. So whizzing on, as I'm running out of time, to just kind of give you a few examples of what the radical scientist politics looked like in practice. So these are just a couple of examples of the Radical Science Journal, published in the 70s. And in one of them, in a seminal article by Bob Young in 1977 entitled Science is Social Relations, Bob Young argued that the lives of radical scientists should involve prefigurative struggle towards socialism, even if this means burning some boats and or biting some hands that have feathers or might do. An example of this in practice is my interviewee, Peter Harper's disillusionment with academic science. He told me that in 1970, he quit his PhD in brain chemistry, provoked by the pervasive sense of looming ecological disaster. He says the logic was that it was all hands on deck. If the world is really falling apart, then you don't just carry on with your research. Another of my interviewees, Marianne Craig, used her MPhil funding to pay herself a salary while she set up Buzzard's Women in Work Hazards group. She told me that it was bourgeois to get a postgraduate degree, and that Northeast London Polytechnic, where she was supposed to be studying, didn't give her a hard time because they were all trots and they didn't care. So instead of writing her thesis, she researched and wrote the Office Workers Survival Handbook. At the time, office workers weren't unionised, and this was significant because it allowed her to take science politics into the women's movement. The broader work hazards group, which was a huge part of what BSSRS did, put the ethos to make evidence-based science more widely available, particularly to those affected by its adverse applications. Doc Griffiths, one of my interviewees, recalls it was trying to use science for more than just exploring the world. And Colin Fernhurst emphasised that the notion of reinterrogating your scientific background and using it for other purposes was really critical at the time. And the collective would translate academic papers in scientific journals into broadsheets, articles, and pamphlets to distribute to the workers. And the text in these publications was often illustrated with really great cartoons, a few of which are here. And they're really kind of appealing, but also, I think, very poignant. And there's, again, obvious parallels that you can make with workers in today's societies that are working for corporations that monopolize the markets. BSSRS magazine, Science for People, positioned itself between Undercurrents, an alternative environmental and tech magazine, and the Radical Science Journal, which approached science from a more explicitly Marxist, academically oriented perspective. And they operated from an office on Poland Street known as the Counter Civil Service because of the number of Roundtree-funded political groups it housed. And this was significant, I think, because it provided a base beyond the university environment and embedded BSSRS members in an alternative scene, which included social organisations outside of purely academic science, like Friends of the Earth, the feminist magazine Spare Rib, and Gingerbread, which it was and is an organisation for single parent families who were still stigmatised at the time. So one thing to say about the publications, the newsletter that then evolved into this really interesting and visual aesthetic magazine, is that Chris Ryan, who was one of my interviewees, was, I think, the designer editor of Science for People over a period of its existence. And he told me that we really had the idea that it would sit alongside New Scientist as a kind of radical New Scientist, bringing ethics back to science. They wanted it to function as a subversive magazine, but one that provided a potentially more mainstream outlet for their ideas beyond academia and science. So I think aesthetics were a conscious part of this project. Its creators were evidently aware of the currency of visual aesthetics, and its do-it-yourself stylization is kind of striking odds with or deliberately deviant from conventional scientific papers. By design, Science for People aimed to break away from the influence of the academic and political establishments and to emphasize a reflexive social and political core agenda. Part of my dissertation also sort of looked at the influences, whether conscious or not, on the designers of the magazine, and yeah, kind of explored this in more detail. And I came across a very interesting couple of designers who speak really eloquently about why graphic forms are significant, saying that they carry their history encoded as conventions, charged with cultural values and loaded with social implications. In choosing a particular form of communication, we perpetuate ways of thinking. Any system of formal organisation expresses an attitude towards knowledge and its representation. The structure of information becomes part of its meaning as form. And yeah, so just to kind of conclude, if we think about the many, many issues that humanity faces today, we can kind of make obvious and maybe more intricate parallels between then and now. We're kind of perpetually always trying to keep up with the push and pull of technological advances, and ethics and the legal system are constantly trying to keep up with advances in science and technology. And an interesting parallel to my job now, which is at Undaunted, which is completely to do with climate change innovation. I work with startups, and there are a few examples of their technology embedded in these really interesting collages here. And the whole point of that is to, I guess, redirect funds to people thinking creatively about how to create a future for ourselves. And I thought I'd just end with Chris Ryan's quote that it was and still is in lots of ways a real basis for hope that we can intelligently redesign what we find we need for our existence. So that's the end of a whistle-stop tour through my dissertation.
Thanks so much, Claudia. What a great talk, packed with stuff. And I can remember reading it some years ago, as you say, and there was so much material to go on, and yet you somehow fit it all into one dissertation. I mean, I think that most people listening to this would assume it was a PhD or a book that you're presenting rather than sort of a chapter, as it were. I've got loads of points to raise, but you and I already talk all the time. So any questions from the audience, please? We've got 10, 15 minutes.
Colin.
Can you hear me okay?
Yeah, all good.
Yeah, okay. Yes, well, thanks, Claudia. That's really interesting. I've taken you back 40 years. It took me back 50 years. So one of the things that I think you brought out well, but is worth emphasizing, is the extent to which in BSSRS we saw ourselves as an umbrella organization of the radical science movement. And the fact, of course, that we had 9 Poland Street as the sort of office was very useful, not just to BSSRS as the umbrella organization, but also for the various groups that worked with it. But for myself, I mean, I was on the editorial collective of Science for People for most of the 1970s, but a lot of the sort of what I would consider radical science that I was doing was done through the Politics of Health group, which was affiliated to BSSRS, Radical Statistics, which was affiliated to BSSRS and still is running, and also the Radical Statistics Health group. That my interest being in, particularly as a statistician, in health inequalities, which brought me into those areas. You made the point that I moved from, well, not really moved, because I still call myself a libertarian socialist. And I moved from London to Sheffield in the 1980s. And the reason why I was very happy to work alongside a Labour local authority at the time is because, particularly in Sheffield, they were taking forward some of the ideas like the Lucas Shop Stewards alternative plan for aerospace, which BSSRS had been quite prominent in publicising. Mike Cooley, who was president of TAS at the time, was an active member in BSSRS, and they produced this alternative plan for using Lucas technologies for much more socially responsible uses. And when I moved to Sheffield, the local authority, led by a character called David Blunkett at the time, whatever happened to him, they were taking forward these ideas, particularly in the economic sphere, and looking for, and so for me, that was a time when we talked about local socialism. And one of my big beefs with New Labour is that it completely lost any sense of the progressiveness, including the aforementioned David Blunkett, of what was so positive about local socialism. I just want to finish up with a story which other people might find quite amusing. Prior to my involvement in BSSRS, which started from the early 70s, I did pursue what Marianne called a bourgeois postgraduate degree at Imperial College. I was a student at Imperial College in 1968, 1969, doing a one-year master's in statistics and operational research. At the time, there existed a group called the Revolutionary Socialist Students Federation. Okay, Revolutionary Socialist Students Federation. It was a national umbrella organization, but also there were local branches. And there was a local branch at Imperial College. And interestingly enough, one of the groups that was aligned to RSSF at Imperial College was the Liberal Society, not the Labour Society, because the defining issue at the time was Vietnam. And whereas the Labour Party with Harold Wilson was not opposing the American war in Vietnam, the Liberal Party was. And I tell that because it's quite amusing to think that the Liberal Society belonged to something called the Revolutionary Socialist Students Federation, but they did. But the sense in which issues defined, rather than what you belong to, so that sense of movement was really quite broad and all encompassing. And again, let's say final word. Thank you very much, Claudia. I found that really interesting, and I found it very interesting to be a participant in the study.
Thanks, Colin. That was great. Any further questions for Claudia? Michael Paraskos has one. Over to you.
Okay, I hope you can hear me. I'm using my phone, so if you can't hear me, well, you can't hear me. That was wonderful, Claudia. Thank you very much indeed. You mentioned a little bit on this, but I wondered if you say a little bit more about the graphics of some of these magazines, because they are very like, as you know, I'm sure, a lot of the radical art magazines of the time, and think of Flux and Situationist and all the much smaller groups as well. And I'm wondering, maybe Colin, you can also come in on this. How much contact was there with the art world?
That's a really good question. And I guess that was a question I had for the interviewees. And Colin, definitely dip in here with any thoughts and kind of knowledge that you have from being involved in the putting together of that magazine. There was really... Oh, yeah, go for it.
Okay, well, I mean, you mentioned the Situationist movement. Of course, coming as it did in the early 70s, it was very much post-Paris 1968 and the sloganeering and the graphics of Situationism and I suppose libertarian socialism more widely than the Situationist movement. But yes, it was very, very influential at the time.
Yeah, and I think even though I think I remember Chris Ryan, who was the editor of Science for People at a time, said that maybe he wasn't consciously aware of putting that imagery into the magazine. But, then Colin obviously now reflects back and says that it was very influential. And I just think that there was such a distinction between that very plain newsletter that it started off as for the first few years, and then suddenly you have this like explosion of kind of collage and kind of creativity of the cartoons and how that brought to life the things that the stories and the kind of the points that they were making, and I guess gave them agency in different contexts, which is kind of a perpetual question. I talk to scientists all the time who are even trying to become more kind of affiliated with each other within the sciences, never mind with like society outside of that context. So how do you communicate between people and make people and kind of bring people into the conversation? And I think that's one way you do it. And there is sort of interesting things to say about how the impact that those sorts of things make as well. So that those couple of front covers that I showed you that had like a collage of lots of different people, or like people moving en masse in protest, they are kind of powerful, like impactful. That imagery actually is striking and is used in the fine art world. So Hannah Hock, there was a painting, those sitting next to each other, I can share my screen again, them sitting next to each other was just showed the kind of the utilization of that kind of technique, I guess, here.
Thanks, Claudia. I think that point's finished. Has anyone got a next point for Claudia or for more general discussion? I have one. Oh no, someone wants to share the slides to be shared. Okay, we'll address that later. But you mentioned the Worski thesis of several waves of generations of people becoming interested in radical science in the 30s and the 70s. It's almost like we're seeing a live version of it happening now from the 70s into the 2010s, 2020s. But I mean, to what extent did your interviewees speak of building on historical precedent? And if so, what were the historical precedents they thought they were building on? What was the kind of force of history behind them? Did they have a sense of this?
I think they did, and Worski obviously did. So he was a member of BSSRS and has kind of become a historian of radical science. So he is obviously very interested in the kind of layering of thought in that space. I think they did, in the sense that that kind of fertile ground of figuring out what kind of socialist they were. I mean, when I started doing the dissertation, I didn't know really anything about politics, and I found myself confronted with the many different types of Marxism and socialism and all the intricacies between these things and how people identified themselves then and what it all means now. And so I think they must have been aware of, and I know at that time as well, the kind of existential crisis that maybe people who had aligned themselves with the Communist Party were feeling when that first communist experiment of the kind of Soviet Union had unraveled, and obviously was having an impact in many ways in which people wouldn't align themselves with. And so there would have definitely been kind of a conscious non-alignment with that kind of thinking and that kind of socialism. And I think maybe that did push them into possibly a more kind of radical way of thinking, maybe. And it's just interesting that at the time, the idea of revolution and anarchy in that socialist libertarian movement, maybe they weren't looking at the kind of the contradictions or the conflicts or the tension in that. Whereas now we can look back and see, again, now we have the benefit of hindsight, as they did when they looked back at the communist project in Soviet Russia. We can look back at their part of the 20th century and pull out sort of threads and see maybe what the kinds of things that may have led to where we are today.
Thank you, Claudia. We've got a couple of minutes. We're actually allowed to overrun if we want, but we'll see how it goes. Has anyone got any more further points of discussion? I'm sure we actually have some other visitors members in this meeting right now. If you want to contribute, please do so. For example, the influence on school teachers. You mentioned a very conscious tactic. I shan't mention who I know is involved in that. Can I just say the other one, to build on Colin's point, if nobody wants to raise anything right now. I'm sorry, Felicity, over to you.
Yeah, thanks. I think we've probably talked about this before, Claudia, but so what intrigues me about the story is that moment of how the radical science aligns with libertarianism, and you know that the left libertarian at the same time as the right libertarian, and I'm sort of interested in that through having sort of kept a weather eye on what the members of the Revolutionary Communist Party did and went on to do in sort of infiltrating a number of scientific organizations when the RCP sort of broke up and Living Marxism was disbanded. And seems to me, you know, what happened to them was the libertarianism became all there was and ended up being, you know, right-wing, pro-corporate, pro-technology form of libertarianism. So I just wondered if in your investigations, or perhaps with Colin, if you want to lob in here, you know, just sort of filling in that, well, you know, yeah, how did all that happen?
Can I say a word? But I mean, the first thing I'd say is, of course, that when we described ourselves as libertarian in the early 1970s, the right wing had not co-opted that term at the time, you know, and it came to us as a bit of a slap in the face when we suddenly found that there was a sort of full circle being drawn, and people in the right were talking about individual, but using mechanisms which we wouldn't have recognised whatsoever, you know, and that's in a sense why I would have always called myself, and still do, a libertarian socialist, rather than a libertarian, which in some senses leaves it open to that sort of lack of specificity about it. But, you know, at the time, you know, the right had not co-opted the word libertarian. That came later.
Yeah, I think it's a really interesting question that is so relevant. I've just been listening to a new podcast about conspiracy theories and how they were sort of doing a case study of Totnes, and so some of the people they were interviewing were saying that all of our sort of hippie friends from days gone by, who we were, they classed them as very good friends, are somehow now, have somehow gone through something whereby they've come out another side, and that I don't have any sort of intellectual things to say about it other than it's really fascinating, and I think ongoing research will have things to say about it, and we'll look back at this period of time with interesting things to say.
I think that I grew up near Totnes, so I was intrigued to hear those programs, and I think it's a slightly different process going on there, but I think that's about a sort of anti-establishmentism, which has always been there in Totnes, well, always since I was a kid at least, and what the participants in that program refer to as, hippies, that sort of anti-establishment thing, then being very vulnerable, I suppose, to being sort of co-opted by these conspiracy theorists.
Thank you. Michael Paraskos for the point.
Yeah, so just following on from that, I mean, I think we have to bear in mind these things are never fixed. I mean, what one meant by these things, I think you've kind of intimated this as well, Colin, and that what one meant by these things in the past and what one means now are not quite the same thing. I mean, if you think back to, well, Neil Kinnock as head of the Labour Party, it was still Labour Party policy to leave the EU, and I would have supported that. So before Nigel Farage, I would have been a Brexiteer. As soon as you end up with, that being co-opted with the right on the political spectrum, you have to kind of reevaluate yourself and saying, well, who are the people I'm keeping company with now? So it's kind of a dance with politics, I feel, on these things. It's not a fixed state. One is a libertarian socialist or an anarcho-syndicalist or whatever one wants to describe oneself as.
Yeah, I think that was. I was just going to say, I think that was something that Michael and I spoke about as well. How complicated it is when you're trying to find a political identity, and how complex people are when it's such a potentially binary thing, and in reality people aren't that clear cut on different issues. They feel different ways about different things, and it's just that we have a kind of democratic system where we are often presented with two kind of main parties, and it's always more complicated than that. And I think maybe the more I sort of started researching what the terminology meant, the more I started having like my own kind of conflicts about, well, where do I stand on all these things and on any given subject, and realizing that I wasn't one thing or another necessarily. I'm a bit of a mixture, and probably most people are if they're given time to think about it.
Thank you. Yeah, absolutely. The porousness.
Yeah, and
Go on.
I was just saying the context changes, and so what that means changes as well. We are social beings.
Thanks. We're running out of time, but does anyone have any final points? I mean, we could all talk about this, I think, for another hour, but has anyone got any real clinchers here, or any messages for Claudia, or further points to make? Okay. Well, thank you for all attending. It's been a wonderful, vivid seminar, and I really feel that this work has developed over time. And I think I agree with some of the people in the comments. It would be great to see this as a study published somewhere. I'm sure many of the people on the call would be supportive in advising and editing and so on, whatever you might want to do with it. And good luck with everything at Undaunted. I know it's a relatively new job, so I'm sure it's going well, and I'm sure it will continue to do so. And thank you to everyone for joining this seminar, Centre for Languages, Culture, Communication at Imperial College. And look forward to seeing you. This is the last one of the academic year, but we'll have a whole program for the next year. We're just developing it now. And stay in touch with the department. We look forward to seeing you soon. Bye for now.
Thank you. Bye.
Thanks, Claudia.